but we've got about, 45 minutes or so. And
Questions also.
And questions. So start thinking about what your questions are going to be for Mary. Unless she answers all of them all at one time, which would be great. And I would like to invite Todd up to give a little introduction to who Mary is.
Friends, it's good to see you. Some who are in the parlor, I think, are about to make their way in, so we'll get getting started. I'll just say a few words of appreciation. I've been here 16 years. I've enjoyed getting to know Mary over those years and her parents. Partly getting to know her through her parents, and they're talking about her with such pride and joy as parents of their college president daughter. The Brown family was quite something, each one of them, and Mary certainly held her own among her siblings. But college professor, college president, helped start a new university in China, which has been just an incredible project, given all the challenges that come with that. But also someone who's kept their finger on the pulse, so to speak, of U.S.-China relations, and written about that and spoken about that and cares about that passionately. And I suppose from hearing about this book, I look forward to reading it. It's part of what's the motivation for this book was to talk about those relationships between U.S. and China that go so deep, but are fraught with so many challenges. It is our good privilege to see Mary regularly in worship, to have this world-renowned scholar and leader and administrator in our midst, who's very humble and who loves to walk around Decatur and get her exercise, and has a wonderful life partner, George Brown Bullock, in the back. So welcome to you both. Welcome home. We're glad you're here, and we look forward to hearing about this book.
Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming, actually, on a cold, wintry day. But I'm very glad to see all of you. And, it's really great to be part of this community. So thank you. I must say that my life, in a sense, has come full circle. I was surprised that it has always, as Todd said, come back to China. And so this book is autobiographical in a sense, but it is also how I looked at China from years of living in Asia, to 2 stints at Agnes Scott College, to living and teaching in China, and to many points in between. In recent years, I've often been asked, what is it like to be a college president? And I have also been asked about my views of China. I must say that this book talks more about China than it does about Agnes Scott. I suppose that is intentional. How did my views of China evolve? And how have my own experiences shaped those views? So first of all, this is an autobiographical book. What does my missionary background mean? Many of you, knew my parents. They were longtime members of this church, but you may not know that both sets of their parents were also missionaries in Asia. And I have also always been interested in my grandparents' life in China and in Korea. Maybe this is because I am a historian. Maybe it is because my life is not that different in a way from theirs. And definitely it's because I knew them. Even today, I have my paternal grandfather Brown's letters, China letters, from the 30s and 40s on my desk, by my desk. I hope to write about them in coming months. And so, but in this book, there's much about their lives and about my own life in growing up in Korea, Japan, and the United States. And scattered through this are comments about missionaries. I do see, I think you have to read this and probably will not fully understand what it means to be a missionary kid. I certainly do not fully understand this. I write about the secular education being a substitute for missionaries, and that is one way to look at this. But there's no question that my Asia background provided me with a lens to look at this today's world. And so I wanted to write and to think about this. A sophomore, Agnes Scott, teacher, English professor, some of you may remember her, Miss Trotter. I had her for a whole year. Anyway, she kept saying, if you cannot write it, you do not know it. I've never forgotten that. If you can't write it, you don't know it. So anyway, the chapters of the book that were most difficult for me were the chapters on Japan and the Rockefellers. I was not so sure how much I remembered about Japan, although I lived there twice, and I had to go back to old yearbooks and my brother George to be again remembering my time in Japan. And also, I had not realized it until I started writing, that thinking about the Rockefeller family and their influence in China has been with me a long time, a really long time, as you'll find out, continuity over time. So my interviews with Rockefeller-funded Peking Union Medical College graduates I interviewed many of these people over different decades at different times. And my own views of China and my views of American educated elites changed as a result of knowing these people. Only this summer, a PUMC faculty member spent several days with us. So she and I had a great time just talking about this school and the Rockefeller family. Not until chapter 6, so well into this book, I realized I started to talk about being Agnes Scott's president. In a way, the variety of my previous work was useful. To be effective as a college president, and I guess as a minister also, you have to have some distance. There's a danger that you'll take institutional issues, and there were many, as some of you may remember, you may take them personally. You cannot, you should not. I don't say in this book how important some of my co-leaders were in helping me realize that. People like Leanne Gay Hudson, Ed Sheehy, Bill Gailey, Louis Thing. You may not know them, but they were very helpful to me. And Decatur, of course, the town of Decatur and the institution's effect on me was quite considerable. I became more of a feminist, and I learned the benefits of diversity. I wanted the college, Agnes Scott College, to rediscover its excellence. And I wanted, and I still want, it to be more plugged in to Decatur. I did not begin with buildings in mind, but when George and I go back to Agnes Scott, and some of you walk around this, I realize how much we did do in 11 years to create new and a renovated campus. I hope if you haven't done so, you'll walk down the street, go to Agnes Scott, just walk around, and you'll see the beauty of this small campus. But this book is mainly about China. Readers thought there should be more about China. I went through and I added in the story of my mother's Chinese coat, for example. That was added later. Even when I was a student at Agnes Scott, there were no courses on Asia. But still, I was interested since I lived in Asia so long. As a student, I wrote about Mao Zedong. And as Agnes Scott president, I took faculty to China and hired Asianists in the history and economics departments. Maybe the most important chapter, however, is chapter 4, my years at the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China, CSC, PRC. Through them, I went to China first in 1974, and I worked on cultural relations with China, with them for 15 years. I have received so many comments, so many emails from colleagues who did not know very much about those years. They were tough. They were a tough but a wonderful time. I traveled around both China and the United States. I learned so much about academics in both countries, and I felt the two countries begin to come together. I'll never forget, actually, my first natural scientist, Gu Chu. In 1974, he was staying at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., and the dessert waitress came to our table, and he had not said anything, hardly anything, the whole day. This was his first night back in the United States. He immediately woke up and said, apple pie a la mode. I have waited decades for a piece of American apple pie. I'll never forget that. That made me begin to feel close to that group. But I also saw many difficulties, and these have continued. And I do write about those difficulties during that time period. But I have never given up on China. And my most recent stint as Vice Chancellor of Duke Kunshan University reveals that faculty autonomy and academic freedom were always issues, especially at Duke, but also in China. But living in China during Xi Jinping's early years was a dream, for me at least, a dream come true. All the preparation for university leadership at the CSC PRC, at the Wilson Center, and Agnes Scott came when I went to China. I'll never forget the first day I was in China at this time, and it was very cold. I mean, it was very cold. It was January, and about 10 of us sat around a Chinese table, and we decided then and there how to start a joint venture university. I didn't realize that I knew how to do it, but I did. And so anyway, we continued. A startup hardly describes the steps of doing this. I personally did everything from Xeroxing, especially to hiring. I think I have on in my bedroom a picture of the people I hired in 3 years, maybe 40, 50 people. I mean, I spent so much time interviewing Chinese and Americans to come to Kunshan. At one point, I thought, I can't do it. I just can't do it. I was the only American, or one of the only Americans at that time. And I did bring a colleague from the United States, from Atlanta actually, Penny Prime, and she helped tremendously. Together, we wrote a faculty handbook. I didn't know I could do this. We found a hotel to give us classroom and dormitory space, and we created a pilot liberal arts program, and on and on. Today, just 10 years later, DKU thrives. George and I just received a 10-year booklet describing what they have done in the last 10 years. I could actually recognize different parts of this. Of course I could, because we started this in China at that time. The last couple of years have been very difficult. There's no question about that. I don't know the details yet, but I do know that there are 400 students from around the world in the freshman class. So the last chapter of this book was an effort to think through the many boards on which I have served. This was prompted in part from my son, a question from him. He said, board members, they don't make any difference. I thought, oh my God, I spent my life being a board member. For nonprofit boards, I do know that a CEO makes all the difference. A CEO, it makes the decisions. As a board member, you can watch, but you cannot necessarily change the direction of an institution. Board members must be more indirect, must be more subtle. And I found this difficult. You know, I would rather be a leader with real responsibility than a board member. But this chapter and thinking of the different boards I have served on made me think much more about leadership. What is leadership? And also more about the trajectory of U.S.-China relations. Almost all of these organizations had a history of involvement in China, but it ended abruptly in 1949 or 1950. And they spent the next 2 or 3 decades trying to go back to China. As a board member, I was a part of the debate about how to re-engage China, how to go back to China, and on what terms to go back. And so during the reform period, roughly the late 70s until the mid-2010s, China did welcome back US-based organizations, in part because Chinese people wanted a more cosmopolitan viewpoint, and also because American know-how was very much needed. But today, because China is much stronger and less dependent, and yes, because the cosmopolitan spirit seems ended or truncated, these organizations are struggling to stay relevant, struggling to stay in China. I have seen and been part of this trajectory. So this last chapter was a way to summarize a life of engagement with China and to recognize that we have entered a new period. So what does this new period involve? I think most of us came of age thinking of China as isolated, as poor. But today, China is everywhere. Geographically, strategically, politically, economically. Yet in many ways, I find my early experiences instructive. Contacts, even limited ones, are important. Travel is difficult, but it can be done. China then, as now, is not monolithic. China is vast. It has tremendous variety. And the views of the people also are tremendously varied. China will always be with us. One must reach out and be part of the rekindling of U.S.-China relations. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Yes, Fred.
All right, so I remember when you came to Agnes Scott as president, and I was involved with some Decatur
I remember.
issues and stuff, and I admired how you reconnected or resurrected some connections between the school and the city, and you really put a lot of time and effort into it. So I always appreciated that, but it's interesting to hear you talk about, because I always thought back then, still do, that you had these immense leadership capabilities, and it came natural to you, and that you were, quote unquote, a born leader. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how you have kind of reviewed or thought about how you were able to do some of this stuff. And you mentioned like writing a handbook and interviewing people and putting the pieces together, and sometimes you had to second guess yourself.
You know, Fred, it's interesting. I think back on, I think it was maybe my first speech at the Decatur Rotary, and I thought, what is Decatur? Decatur is Agnes Scott. I did not realize then that Decatur was its own place. And Decatur has only grown at the interim. And Agnes Scott is tiny compared to what Decatur has become. So anyway, I learned as I went along. I think maybe that's a mark of a leader. You have to be willing to learn, to change as you go. Todd.
Mary, with DKU and from its inception to maybe when you left, what did you learn, or what course change happened because of what surprised you, or what did you have to do differently than you expected in that course?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Although I reported to a Chinese chancellor, and he had been president of one of China's great universities. But he was determined to bring an American style of board, American style of leadership to Kunshan, and he wanted change. But he was also very Chinese. George remembers him very well. And I learned a lot from him, actually. The document number 9, which maybe you have read about, came about that just after I went to China. And document 9 was a Chinese Communist Party missive, which said you can't talk about constitutionalism, you can't talk about liberal arts, you can't talk about this and that, which were very much what we were going to do. He kept saying to me, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We will do something different. We will be our own place. And so I learned from him, actually, that was one of my points, that China has many different viewpoints. He also told me repeatedly, don't worry about the arts. They should flourish. They should have a variety. And so I learned from him. Also, certainly in setting up GKU, I also learned that concepts such as academic freedom had a very different meaning in China. Although they would talk about academic freedom, and they believed in academic freedom meant for them to be freer from the State Education Commission. It did not mean to question. It did not mean to ask different kinds of questions to authorities. It had a very different meaning. And so I learned in part that although I thought I knew China in a way, that the words make a huge difference. That you have to say, well, what do you mean by this? Because they don't mean the same thing. I learned also that starting a university is very tough, very hard, actually. I remember that certainly we tried to bring some of Duke and also some of Agnes Scott to Kunshan. And so we had the students, the very first group of students, sign a pledge, an honor pledge, and they had to come up in front of us, in front of their parents, and say that they would not cheat or steal or whatever. And they signed this. This pledge was a combination of Agnes Scott and Duke's pledge, and also it's used to this day. They had never done this before in a different setting. So, we took American concepts to China, but we also learned from them. I think you have to be willing. You may not agree. I did not agree, for example, with some of the things, some of the Chinese goals. And you have to say so. And I do remember, Todd, several very interesting discussions about religion. So in the Chinese Constitution, it says no religious ceremonies, or I've forgotten the adjective, on any campus. I said, well, that is not certainly DKU will not sponsor any religious activities. But if individual faculty or students want to say a prayer, observe Buddha's birthday, whatever, I'm not going to stop them. We had many discussions about this. We agreed to disagree, in a sense. We also agreed to keep it within the campus, that any disagreements should not be more broadly circulated. Chancellor Liu was very much concerned about the reputation of this new university. He did not want it to be known as a place of contention, but he recognized that we would not always disagree, but we would disagree in private. Other questions? Yes.
Did you go back to the Wilson Center in Washington after your residency at Agnes?
I did, yes. I had a great time. From Agnes Scott, I went back to the Wilson Center for about a half a year and started a book about the Rockefellers, another book at that time, and then came back here and taught at Emory. So yes, I've been back and forth.
Woodrow Wilson himself is on a sort of blacklist now, not multicultural enough.
I know. I don't know what they are doing about that, but you're right. I have certainly read that.
Mary Ann?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot of the background behind what you're saying, but I'm interested in the Rockefellers. How were the Rockefellers involved? I don't know the background.
Well, you know, John D. Rockefeller, the original Rockefeller, he wanted to do something for the world, and he thought that medicine was maybe a way to make a difference. He also believed very strongly in the Christian missions. And in fact, when he was very young, before he made all his millions of money, he gave money to missionaries in China. This was around the time of the Civil War, actually a long time ago. But later on, he came to believe that supporting medicine in China was the way he could fulfill some of his goals. And his son, John D. Jr., embodied this in part. And so John D. Jr. Convinced the missionaries that this new medical center would not take away from what the missionaries already did. I think in part it probably did, however, because Peking Union Medical College insisted on teaching in English and insisted on the highest standards, which were very similar to American standards at the time. 4 years of college plus medical school, which was unheard of in China. We're speaking now the late 2010s, so 1910s. But PUMC, the Chinese, I think many Chinese responded very well to this concept of high excellence and wanted to go to this American-funded institution. And so Rockefeller and the family spent a huge amount of money. If you look at the amount of money they spent in China, it dwarfs all the other money they spent compared to America or in China or in Asia, everywhere. They put the money into China. And so and the school and many other schools were fully funded by the Rockefeller family and the Rockefeller Foundation. So many people of that generation owed their future, owed their education to the Rockefeller family. And so the fast forward 3 or 4 decades, and the Rockefeller family, now we're talking David Rockefeller and his descendants, continue to think of China as a place they should be giving money, they should support, they should visit. And so I came to know all these generations of Rockefeller family members today and have been very surprised that they continue to be so interested in China. So it's a long story, but a good story in a way of American involvement in China.
So the Rockefellers then were involved in this university you were
Yes.
involved in?
No, they were not involved in that university, but their money then went through the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. It mainly supported biomedical, other fields of medicine, etc., and also the social sciences, but not my university.
Is it still involved?
What?
Is it still involved? The Rockefeller Foundation?
The Rockefeller Foundation, maybe 5 years ago, started to pay its attention to Africa, and maybe mainly Africa. And so the Rockefeller Foundation, for the first time in more than a century, did not pay attention to China. I don't know about today. about the family members per se.
So what is the status of that medical school today?
Okay, the medical school thrives. If you go to China and you stay, and I always did, and this time I stayed at, these times, I stayed at the Hyatt, Rockefeller Hyatt Hotel. I mean,
Grand Hyatt,
Reagan Hyatt.
downtown Beijing.
Downtown Beijing. You could look down from the windows and see the Rockefeller funded complex. All around it are more modern medical centers. And so it today is known as a center of medical work in China.
So it's highly respected?
It's highly respected. It's like, in a sense, it's like NIH, like in America. So it grew, I mean, it had many difficult times. When the Rockefeller name was never mentioned at all, as we can understand. But today, I think it's thriving. And so, yes, there are Peking medical colleges, maybe better, and maybe Fudan, but it's in the top 3 medical schools and medical complexes in China. So anyway, the moral of my story, I must say, is pick a very good dissertation topic, even though you don't know it's going to be so good, for it lives with you forever. Todd?
I'm curious about the reflecting on your presidency at Agnes Scott and kind of where Agnes Scott is today. Not only maybe looking back, what impact your background had for helping Agnes Scott become more international, but also I'm curious how you've been involved over the years in connecting students to Agnes Scott.
You know, when I first went back to Agnes Scott as president, I had always been in the man's world, foreign affairs of one type or another. I was not sure how I would respond to an all-woman's environment. And actually, that's when I say I became more of a feminist at Agnes Scott. When I returned, certainly, I saw the students thrive as a result of coming to a women's college. And I did try, I remember in my inaugural talk, I talked about making the Woodruff Commons, which was a sort of a square, a global commons, more of a global place. But this was not new. My predecessor, Ruth, she also wanted to bring the world to Agnes Scott, so it was not entirely new. And my successors have also been very internationally minded. So Elizabeth Gish, who some of you know, she is now in England running the Rhodes Scholar Program. And her successor, who is president now, Lee Zach, came from DC, from Washington, with a very international background. So I think the international emphasis has continued. I think the school is quite different today. I think it should be different. And so it's more diverse. It more reflects where we live than when I was a student. Certainly when I was a student, even I began this as president. I was not involved at all for the long period of time after leaving Agnes Scott. I went back as a member of the board about 8 years ago, and I saw both Elizabeth and her successor try to deal with whatever the issues that come about. And I think one of them is how to get the students to appreciate Decatur, actually. I don't think that has gone away as a problem. Yes?
So I had the good fortune to know your parents, because we were in a great red group with them years ago, and I actually, your dad told me about you before I ever had any inkling you'd ever be president of Agnes Scott. So, but could you, and I didn't realize that their parents had been missionaries in China. Could you touch a little bit on that history and what it was like to grow up? And it's probably in your book, which I'm going to buy, but how old are you in that photo?
I was young. This is my first trip to China in 1974. So I was about 30, I was 30 years old at that time. My father grew up in China. And certainly, although he came to love Korea, as Todd spoke at lunch to us about, he never forgot China. And so I grew up knowing that he wanted to go back to China, but couldn't. And certainly my grandfather, it was captured by the communists, always was in a small town, what was then a small town, a walled city. The same province I went back to, Duke of Kunjan. But certainly my grandfather's letters about being in China, and I mentioned that in my talk, my grandfather's letters about the poverty, about the warlords, about the bandits, about were exciting to me. And so I grew up with a sense of excitement. China is exciting in a way that I never felt about Korea. I should have, but I never did. My mother grew up in Korea. And so my mother actually grew up very near where I grew up in Korea, southern Korea. And she spoke fluent Korean, and she actually was kind of Korean in a sense. She was, she could get very feisty because, and we used to say it was because of her red hair, which she had red hair. So anyway, those were interesting times, and I saw my parents as a young girl. I saw them accommodate and the difficulties of being a missionary in Asia at that time.
And she went to Agnes Scott too.
What?
She did. She went to Agnes Scott too, right?
She went to Agnes Scott, right. Yes, with your mother?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I thought, right. Yes.
Where can you buy your book?
Okay, so there are copies of my book in the back. You can buy it at Eagle Eye. And whatever he has in the back, I'm happy to sign them at any time. There's another person here, Larry, where are you? There you are. He has great pictures of China of late, more recent.
I got them back there, some of them. Well,
Stand up.
I don't want to take away from all of
I want you to speak.
Get me start talking, you're in trouble. There were 8 of us, and our spouses. There are a total of 19 from Georgia Tech went over there for 11 days. And I joined them up in Montreal. We flew over the North Pole to Beijing, and there was no smog when we got there, which is unusual. And like a week out of every year, they have family week because everybody goes off to school for education, and it was a week when we were there, so half of China was in Beijing. I was lucky enough to, one of the gentlemen, he had just sold his business, and he put together this wonderful brochure back there. There's a lot of information in there that if somebody wants to take time to look at it. But I don't want to take away from that. And then I was lucky enough to sit next to Miss Fleming, who was visiting from Park Springs, and she was on a trip over there for a month. So I don't think I could take a month, but we flew twice when we were there, and we were on an ocean. It was like a liner, but we were in the Yantes River. It's a riverboat, they call it. But everything was so big, and this was 2011, and the one thing that I noticed that since I'm in real estate, they had all these shopping centers with facades, McDonald's and all that, and nobody was in there. I took pictures of all these 20-story buildings being built as far as you could see them, and nobody's in them. So I mean, I was thinking the house of cards are there trying to do everything with all new concrete and everything. But there's a lot of people, and the interesting thing, I don't think I realized, and when I was talking to Louise, she was saying the size of China, and you can't even believe it, because we flew twice while we were there. Just to see some of the, and we would go to the homes where they they built this dam, and of course our archaeologists were going crazy over that because everything was being covered over. And we went to this small village where they had done all this, and the small village had 1 million people in it. So you can see, if you can conceptualize or just imagine. Anyway, I just love to listen to you.
Well, listen, I want to urge that people look at his book, because it has great pictures of China at the time. You know, China still has many buildings with nobody in them, but the Gucci and all the other are swamped. Chinese are spending money like crazy. They really enjoy having luxury items. And so I know that when I remember telling George my first time back from Zhuguanchan, well, I will have to buy all new clothes, because my Chinese colleagues dressed so well to come to work at a college of all places. They always looked nice. They always dressed very well. So I think you would find those stores, or people are in those stores, but the buildings are still empty, I'm afraid.
There's an interesting story about concrete. There's they did a study of how much concrete China had poured in like the last 30 years, and it was more than the United States had poured in its entire history.
Oh,
They cornered the market on it one year.
It's just, but the building over the past 30, 40 years, it's been amazing.
the building has been amazing. Certainly, we were talking a bit about Shanghai. If you go to Shanghai now, or you go to Beijing, it's like going to an international, beautiful city. And that was not true 11 years ago, a decade ago. But today, certainly, there are gardens, there are trees there, but at what cost also? Many people were made homeless, many people were moved out as a result, but the cities themselves, some of the cities are truly beautiful. So China today, I urge, maybe you can't go, but you can certainly watch TV and see how China has changed today. I think we have a lot to learn from China. We don't want to be Chinese. We don't want to live there. I don't want to live there. But I must say that the general life of people has definitely improved over time. And so I think that the interesting thing will be how the U.S. adapts to this in the future. Because China will be our rival. It will be a different kind of place. George?
You might mention a couple of anecdotes in the book, namely when your father found out he couldn't go back to China in the late 40s, and maybe an anecdote about President Reagan, when you met with him and about the Boxer Rebellion, when he took a delegation to the White House of Chinese.
Yeah, you know, certainly my dad always wanted to go to China. And so I think I write about this. He wrote on the mission board, send me to China, to China, to China, period. So there was no other place mentioned. And but my early memories are of China falling out, and so where were we to go? We're going to Korea, of course, because my mother came from Korea. And then my dad was preaching why I'm going to Korea as a missionary. And it was Sunday, I've forgotten the date, but 1950. And this man came up to my father and said, have you seen today's paper? And my father said, I was standing right there. My father said, I don't read the Sunday paper until after I have preached. And the man showed my father the picture, the newspaper that said that war had broken out in Korea. And I must say that my own memory is not of the tragedy of Korea or my family, but myself, that all my shots, which we had just finished taking, all these shots were for naught. We would not be going to Korea at that time. And so there was 2 more years before we went eventually to Korea. And I grew up in the, you might say, in the nexus of the Korea, Chinese, American, Communist revolution. It was swirled around me. And I have never forgotten that period. I have gone back over time and written and certainly taught about the Korean War. So that is of great interest to me. You also mentioned one other thing.
Boxer Rebellion,
the
Reagan.
Boxer. So anyway, President Reagan started out very opposed to China. And I was in China actually when Reagan or some of his people invited Taiwan to send a representative to his inauguration. And we were frozen out. But anyway, Taiwanese representatives eventually were not invited. I don't know, they didn't come. Anyway, 2 years later, Reagan was so interested in the Chinese students that came to America. So he invited Chinese students to the White House. So I went, this was when I was at the CSC, PRC. I went also, and wondering what would happen. And certainly Reagan forgot, his message was about the Boxer Rebellion. Don't ever mention the Boxer Rebellion. But Reagan said, you know, so many people went to America because of Boxer fellowships, et cetera, and he entirely put his advisors to shame. And later he went to China and spoke with President of Fudan University, whom I knew, and he welcomed Chinese students to America. And he thought that science was important. And so I saw many changes over time in American involvement with China. And Reagan is a good example of that.
There's a picture of General Marshall with your grandparents in your grandfather's memoir little book.
Yes, that's the very first picture. Is my grandparents were in Suzhou when Marshall came to Suzhou. And he was trying to broker something between the communists and the nationalists, and my grandparents were there. Yes, good question.
Just a,
When did you come to the United States and to stay?
Well, I guess when I went to college, probably. So this would be in 1962. And so I really felt, I started to say fish out of water. I came from Japan at that time, from Canadian Academy, and came to Agnes Scott as a freshman student. And there were nobody else like me at that time. I looked like everybody else. But I remember being asked, well, why aren't your eyes slanted? Why aren't your eyes slanted? Because your parents came from Asia, etc. So yes, I mean, I have gone back, not during those years, but certainly after this year, in 1974, I've gone to China every year, almost every year since then.
You've mentioned living in China and Korea, and how did you get to Japan?
Well, I had an uncle who ran a medical school near Kobe in Osaka.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the main reason. But the first time was my parents studied Korean in Japan to get ready to go to Korea. The war was still going on. And then later my parents sent me and my brother to Japan, to high school, because in Korea there was not a school at that time. So I did, and those were good years for me. They helped me adapt to Agnes Scott in a way, although they were quite different. Still, it was not being homeschooled.
Right.
this is a very specific or maybe very general question, but anyway, since China, for instance, has taken up land in Tanzania and Ukraine, which they can't use right now, do you think China is or could feed itself without a lot of food from other countries now?
It's a good question. I think China does depend right now on other countries' food, but I think China could be self-sufficient if they wanted to be self-sufficient.
They've only got about 5% of the world's arable land. As big
Right.
as it is, there's only like 5% of the world's arable land and 20% of the world's
Right.
population. So
It's
a
tough,
challenge.
but they will need Ukraine, they will need certainly. But right now, I think they are also looking at new varieties of rice, for example. And they import soybeans from us. So China does depend on the world. I think we all depend on the world, one way or another.
That kind of leads me, what do you know of the relationship between China and Africa and their investments in Africa? And what do you see happening there and what?
Well, China is certainly investing more in Africa. And it's hard to say whether the loans that they make are beneficial or not. It depends on who you read, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I think that China sees Africa as part of its future. And so China, and we are scrambling to keep up.
DKU, Duke Kunshan University has 3 sponsors. Duke University, Wuhan University, and the city of Kunshan. Can you relate how the color scheme was put together for the symbols for the school?
You know, my very
Duke
first,
blue.
one of my very first jobs at Kunshan, I met with the party secretary from Kunshan, the president of Wuhan University, and we had representatives from Duke to discuss the logo, what to make the logo of a new university. I thought, this is stupid. But it was, turned out to be a very important meeting. Each entity proposed its own logo, in a sense. So Duke, many of you have been to Duke, had a high cathedral-like tower. Wuhan had a very short, squat, very squat, Chinese library, but very old, very famous, 19th century. And Kunshan logo was clouds. Clouds. So we had clouds, we had high cathedral type structure and a squat library. Many different variations on how to put these three entities together on a little lapel. They were all terrible. I thought they were terrible. I finally said, okay, we will accept Duke Kunshan University. This is the written explanation. We will table the other. This is maybe why I was such a good president, college president. I said, we will table the decision about the logo, what to put on top, because we can't agree. And everybody was so happy not to have the other agreement. A year or two later, so we came back to this. I had by this time, I had a younger staff. I said, we have a problem. We have to come up with a logo that these, our sponsors, will accept. And we found actually that in Shanghai there was a brand company, a company that just focused on brands. So we hired them. They talked to all of us. Anyway, they and my staff, young staff, came up with the concept, okay, we will not use buildings, we will use colors. And so they came up with so Wuhan, the city, the university was dark green. That was their color. Kunshan, their color was a lighter green. And of course, Duke was Duke blue. So even if you go to Duke Kunshan today, on a little lapel, you'll see these three colors, but actually in a bamboo type pattern. And I think it was my Chancellor Liu, said it was like a light burning, a book burning in the middle. I can't see that, but anyway, they never merge. These three colors never merge, but they are distinct. Today, I think that is a symbol of the university in a way. And I think that's how we must deal with China. We are not going to merge, but we will have our own entity.
Thank you. Let's thank Mary for her time.